The Whispering Walls, Part 1. The Silence Before the Voices. Chapter 1. The Ozymandias Apartment. Elissa Chance loved the quiet. Not the sterile, forced silence of a library, nor the oppressive hush of a graveyard, but the deep, resonant quiet that hums with the memory of sound. It was this craving for profound stillness that led her, a historian specializing in the melancholic beauty of urban decay, to the Ozymandias Apartments. Her thesis, The Architecture of Oblivion, How Forgotten Urban Spaces Mirror Collective Memory Loss, was a beast. It demanded silence, total immersion, a place where the clamor of the modern city couldn't intrude. The Ozymandias, tucked away in a district the city had long since shrugged off, promised just that. From the street it was a hulking anachronism, a pre-war relic of a grandeur that had curdled into something darkly impressive. The facade, once proud marble, was now streaked with what looked like weeping wounds. Gargoyles, their faces eroded by a century of wind and neglect, leered down from parapets. The windows, dark and deep-set, seemed to watch her with 1,000 blind eyes. Inside, the silence was palpable, thick as dust. The lobby was a vast, echoing cavern, its once resplendent mosaic floor cracked and peeling like sunburned skin. The air hung heavy with the scent of mildew, old wood, and something indefinably metallic, like forgotten blood. A flicker of movement at the reception desk. A figure emerged from the deep shadows, so still she hadn't noticed him until he shifted. Mr. Silas, the superintendent. He was a man out of time, his skin stretched taut over sharp angles, the color of yellowed parchment. His eyes, though, were unnervingly bright, like polished river stones. A threadbare waistcoat, a rumpled tie. He looked as though he'd been waiting there for decades. "Miss Chance." His voice was a dry rattle, like autumn leaves skittering across pavement. "Yes, that's me. Apartment 2B." Elissa's voice, a little too loud in the oppressive quiet, felt almost vulgar. Silas nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. He extended a hand, palm up, presenting a single heavy brass key. It was cold to the touch, engraved with an ornate 2B that felt ancient under her thumb. "Just the one key?" she asked, surprised. "Most apartment buildings have fobs or a set of keys." "It is all you will require," Silas replied, his gaze unwavering. "A word of warning, Miss Chance." His voice dropped, a near whisper that seemed to emanate from the very walls. "The building remembers everything. Even the things that haven't happened yet." Elissa gave a nervous chuckle, attributing it to the man's eccentricities, another charming feature of the Ozymandias. "Right," she said, trying to inject some lightness into the air. "Well, I suppose that makes it a good source for a historian." Silas didn't smile. He merely watched her, his bright eyes following her as she turned and walked towards the elevator, the heavy brass key a cold weight in her hand. The silence of the Ozymandias swallowed her whole. Her apartment lived up to the building's promise. High ceilings, intricate crown molding that cast dizzying shadows, windows that looked out onto a forgotten alleyway. The wallpaper, a faded floral pattern of pink roses on a cream background, peeled in delicate curls at the seams. It was vast, echoing, and profoundly silent. Perfect, she thought, as she began to unpack her books, her laptop, her life. The first 2 nights were exactly what she craved. The silence was absolute, a velvet cloak that allowed her thoughts to unfurl, her research to take root. She worked late into the nights, surrounded by stacks of books on urban planning and forgotten social histories. The thesis, a knot of ideas and references in her mind, finally began to untangle itself, threads coalescing into a coherent tapestry. She slept soundly, dreaming of crumbling facades and the ghosts of forgotten architects. Chapter 2. The First Whispers. The whispers began on the third night. Elissa had been at her desk, the soft glow of her laptop illuminating the stacks of books around her. The silence, her cherished companion, suddenly seemed ruffled, disturbed. At first, it was just a faint rustling, a papery shiver, that she dismissed as the wind sighing through the ancient fence. The Ozymandias was old, after all. These old buildings creaked, groaned, and hummed with the slow decay of their bones. But then it sharpened. A sound like distant voices murmuring just beyond the threshold of her hearing. It was too soft to discern words, too ephemeral to hold on to, yet it was distinctly there. She paused her typing, held her breath, straining her ears. Nothing. Only the thrum of her own blood. She shrugged, attributing it to fatigue. Her eyes felt gritty, her brain a buzzing hive of information. Maybe she was finally hearing things. But the next night it returned, stronger. She was reading in bed, a heavy volume on early 20th century urban legends resting on her chest. The murmuring started again, a low, collective sigh that seemed to emanate from the very walls around her. This time it wasn't just the wind, it had a timbre, a cadence. Curiosity, the academic's relentless drive, outweighed her nascent unease. She slid out of bed, her bare feet silent on the cold hardwood floor. She pressed her ear to the damp floral wallpaper by her bed. The pattern, those faded pink roses, seemed to swim before her eyes in the dim light. And then she heard them, clearly. Voices. Multiple voices, overlapping, indistinct at first, like a radio dial struggling to find a frequency. But as she listened, heart thrumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs, they solidified. They weren't recounting history, no faded echoes of the past, no spectral retelling of bygone events. They were narrating the immediate future. A woman's voice, thin and reedy, whispered, "We'll drop at 4:12." Another, deeper, like crumbling mortar, added, "The porcelain," a shrill scream. A third, youthful and terrified, finished, "Not for the break, but for the face in the shards." Elissa pulled away from the wall, her breath catching in her throat. She stared at the faded roses, her mind reeling. Mrs. Albright, the sweet grandmother in 3C, who always smiled kindly when they crossed paths in the hallway. Her porcelain teapot, the one Elissa had seen on her windowsill, painted with delicate bluebirds. 4:12 p.m., a face in the shards. It was absurd, impossible. Her rational mind, honed by years of academic rigor, tried to dismiss it as a dream, a trick of the mind, an auditory hallucination brought on by stress and sleep deprivation. She even considered carbon monoxide poisoning, though her landlord had assured her the building was serviced regularly. Yet a cold dread began to seep into her bones, chilling her far more than the Ozymandias' inherent dampness. She knew, with an awful certainty that defied logic, that she hadn't imagined it. The whispers were real, and they were specific. She spent the better part of the next day a nervous wreck, pacing her apartment, trying to dissect what she'd heard. Her thesis on urban decay felt suddenly trivial, irrelevant. The Ozymandias was decaying, yes, but its rot seemed to be a living, breathing thing. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long skeletal shadows across her floorboards, she found herself glancing at her watch with increasing frequency. 3:50, 4:05, 4:10. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She pressed herself against the wall, as if to physically push herself away from the impending event, her eyes wide, unblinking. 4:11. A choked gasp escaped her lips. She heard it, a faint clatter, unmistakable, from the apartment directly above hers. And then a scream. Not a scream of startled surprise, but a raw, tearing sound, thick with terror and revulsion. It was precisely 4:12 p.m. Elissa felt her academic curiosity turn into something cold, something ancient, something that gripped her heart in an icy vice. The walls were not just whispering. They were speaking the truth. Chapter 3. The Broken Teapot. The scream echoed, thin and brittle, through the quiet of the Ozymandias. It was followed by a crash, the unmistakable sound of porcelain shattering on a hard floor. Elissa stood frozen, her hands still pressed against the damp wallpaper, her blood running cold. Mrs. Albright, 3C, the teapot, the face and the shards. She forced herself to move, to put one foot in front of the other. Her conscience, still firmly rooted in the rational world, demanded she check on her neighbor. But every instinct screamed at her to retreat, to lock her door, to pretend she hadn't heard a thing. The hall outside her door was dim, lit by a single flickering bulb. Each step she took felt heavy, weighted with the knowledge of what she was walking into. The air seemed colder here, infused with the residue of Mrs. Albright's terror. She reached the door to 3C, which stood slightly ajar. "Mrs. Albright?" Elissa pushed the door open gently, her voice barely a whisper. The apartment was a tableau of domesticity, instantly shattered by an unseen force. A delicate porcelain teapot, painted with cheerful bluebirds, lay in dozens of gleaming white pieces on the polished hardwood floor. Beside it, Mrs. Albright, a small woman with hair like sponge sugar, sat on the floor amidst the wreckage, her hands trembling, her eyes wide and vacant, staring at the fragments. "Mrs. Albright, are you all right?" Elissa knelt beside her, a tremor in her own hands. She reached out, then hesitated. Mrs. Albright didn't seem to notice her. She was mumbling, her voice a reedy drone. "He was there. He was there." Her gaze was fixed on a larger shard of porcelain at her feet, a curved piece that might have once been the teapot's handle. Elissa followed her gaze. She saw nothing but her own reflection, distorted and fragmented in the glossy surface. But Mrs. Albright saw something else. Her face, usually so kindly and serene, was contorted with a primal fear. "He was looking at me," Mrs. Albright whispered, her voice barely audible. "From inside the white. His eyes, they were so old." Elissa straightened up, her initial concern for her neighbor now laced with a profound, terrifying understanding. Mrs. Albright wasn't screaming because her beloved teapot was broken. She was screaming because of what she had seen, exactly as the walls had whispered. A chill, deeper than any draft, settled over Elissa. This wasn't merely coincidence. This wasn't a trick of her tired mind. The Ozymandias wasn't just old, it was aware. It knew, and it told. She helped Mrs. Albright to her feet, guiding the trembling woman to a worn armchair. "I'll clean this up," Elissa murmured, her eyes scanning the room, half expecting to see a shadowy figure lurking in the corners. The air felt charged, heavy, as if the very molecules were buzzing with unseen energy. As she carefully swept the shattered porcelain into a dustpan, each shard glinted maliciously, reflecting slivers of the dim apartment. She couldn't bring herself to look too closely, a terrifying premonition stopping her. She didn't want to see the face. Later, after Mrs. Albright had been given a tranquilizer by a concerned relative Elissa had called and was tucked into bed, Elissa returned to her own apartment. The silence now felt menacing, alive with unheard whispers. The faint floral pattern on her wallpaper seemed to writhe, the roses blooming with unseen eyes. She pulled out her laptop, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Her thesis, her academic pursuit, felt like a flimsy shield against an encroaching darkness. Urban decay. She had thought she was studying the decay of buildings. Now she understood. She was living in a building that was perhaps decaying her. The Ozymandias remembered, even the things that hadn't happened yet, and Elissa Chance, the historian, knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that she was no longer merely an observer in its quiet demise. She was becoming part of its story. Part 2. The Investigation and Rising Dread. Chapter 4. Harding's Skepticism. A week later, the knock came. 3 sharp official raps that jolted Elissa from a fitful sleep. She had been dreaming of shifting walls and voices that crawled under her skin. The sunlight, weak and watery, barely pierced the grime on her windows. Standing in her doorway was a man who looked distinctly out of place in the Ozymandias, Detective Harding. He was a solid presence, broad-shouldered, with a tired but intelligent face framed by short, practical hair. His suit, though slightly rumpled, spoke of professionalism, a stark contrast to the building's peeling grandeur. "Miss Chance?" he asked, his voice low, his eyes scanning her apartment, taking in the stacks of books, the laptop, the general air of academic disarray. "Yes?" Elissa tightened the belt of her robe. Her nerves, already frayed from a week of escalating whispers and unsettling occurrences, a light bulb exploding without warning, doors creaking open on their own, were stretched thin. "Detective Harding, NYPD. I'm investigating a series of disappearances linked to this address." He produced a badge, its gleam momentarily reflecting the dusk motes dancing in the dim hall light. Elissa's blood ran cold. Disappearances. She remembered a notice board downstairs, yellowed flyers for missing persons that she'd casually dismissed as old news from forgotten years. Now the implication hit her with a physical force. "Come in, detective," she said, stepping aside. He entered, his gaze sharp, assessing. "We've had 3 residents vanish from the Ozymandias in the last 6 months. No forced entry, no struggle, just gone. Our last lead points to a tenant from apartment 4A, a young woman named Sarah Jenkins, who was seen entering the building a fortnight ago and hasn't been heard from since." Elissa felt a prickle of unease. She hadn't seen Sarah Jenkins, but the walls had referred to a young woman who seeks freedom beyond the concrete, her voice fading into the collective murmur. "Just yesterday." "Are you saying the building itself is involved?" Elissa tried to keep her voice even, but a tremor betrayed her. Harding paused, a wry smile playing on his lips. "Miss Chance, I'm a man of facts. My job is to find rational explanations, even in places as atmospheric as this one." He gestured vaguely at the peeling wallpaper. "But I've been in this building for 3 days now, trying to talk to residents, and I'm beginning to feel like I'm walking through a dream. Everyone's evasive, or they just don't seem to remember things clearly." He looked at her expectantly. "Have you noticed anything unusual? Any strange sounds? Neighbors acting oddly?" Elissa hesitated. How could she explain? That the walls whispered the future? That she knew Mrs. Albright saw a face in a teapot shard? That Silas, the superintendent, seemed like a gatekeeper to something ancient and hungry? She was a historian, a rationalist. Her reputation, her sanity would be questioned. Yet the dread coiled tighter. Harding, for all his skepticism, was here, investigating. Perhaps he needed to know. The building felt like a living thing, and it was reaching out. "Detective," she began, her voice low, "I have heard things, strange things." She lowered her gaze, then met his. "Sounds that aren't just the wind." Harding raised an eyebrow, a hint of professional skepticism hardening his features. "And what kind of sounds would those be, Miss Chance?" She took a deep breath. Whispers. He sighed, a long, weary sound. "Miss Chance, I appreciate your time, but if you're experiencing some kind of auditory hallucination, perhaps you should—" "No," she interrupted, a sudden burst of conviction washing over her. "They're not. They're real, and they tell the future." Harding stared at her, his expression a mixture of pity and bemusement. "The future, you say?" Elissa felt a surge of frustration, but also a chilling certainty. She knew he wouldn't believe her without proof. And the walls, she realized, were already providing it. A low hum started, a familiar vibration in her apartment, and then the voices coalesced, faint yet clear, directly behind her. "The man of law will find the cellar's secret." Elissa's blood ran cold. The walls were whispering about Harding. She glanced at him, his mouth already forming a polite dismissal. "But his gun will misfire when the shadows move." She clamped her mouth shut, her heart pounding. She had to tell him. It was a warning. Chapter 5. The Basement's Shadow. "Detective Harding," Elissa said, her voice strained, pushing past the thrumming in her ears. I know this sounds insane, but the walls just whispered something about you. They said the man of law will find the cellar's secret, but his gun will misfire when the shadows move. Harding's dismissive smile faltered. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of something unreadable passing through them. Miss Chance, I assure you my weapon is meticulously maintained. And as for cellars, I've already tried the building's main basement. It's empty storage, dead ends. It's not just a cellar, Elissa insisted, clutching her arms, trying to ward off the sudden, intense cold that filled the room. The walls, they guide, they mislead, they want you there. The skepticism was still etched on Harding's face, but beneath it, Elissa detected a tremor. He was a man of logic, but the Ozymandias was beginning to unravel even his carefully constructed reality. The whispers continued, a low chorus behind her, confirming the veracity of her prediction. The building, it seemed, was growing impatient. Harding tried to regain his composure. Look, Miss Chance, I appreciate your creativity, but I have actual police work to do. I need to re-examine the blueprints, see if there's an overlooked access point to the utilities or a sub-basement. He stood up, making to leave. As he turned towards the door, Elissa heard a sharp crack from the hallway, like old wood groaning under immense pressure. The faint light in the corridor outside her apartment flickered, then died, plunging the hall into near total darkness. Harding instinctively reached for the flashlight on his belt, his hand brushing against the holster of his service weapon. Then a low, guttural murmur echoed from the depths of the building, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It was less a whisper, more a collective growl. The air grew heavy, almost viscous. What was that? Harding's voice was sharper now, his professional veneer cracking. The building, Elissa whispered, fear drying her throat. It wants you to go to the cellar. It's leading you. Suddenly, the floor beneath them seemed to shift, a subtle tremor that vibrated through Elissa's feet. A groan, deep and resonant, resonated through the structure, as if the foundations themselves were protesting. A section of the hallway wall, previously solid, now looked different. A faint, almost imperceptible line appeared, tracing what looked like a doorframe that hadn't been there before. Harding stared at it, his eyes wide. He approached it cautiously, running a gloved hand along the newly formed seam. That's impossible, he breathed. That wall was solid yesterday. I checked these corridors meticulously. They tried the handle that had materialized on the door. It turned with a creak, revealing a narrow, impossibly dark opening. A draft, cold and smelling of damp earth and something far older, rushed out. This was a new way down, a way the building had created. No, detective! Elissa cried, but it was too late. Harding, driven by a primal investigative instinct, coupled with an undeniable fear, had already stepped through. He gripped his flashlight, switching it on, its beam spearing the gloom. Elissa heard his footsteps descend, echoing into the blackness. The air thinned, and she felt a pressure behind her eyes. The walls, it seemed, were closing the trap. Panic seized her. She couldn't let him go alone. The whisper about the gun misfiring. She had to help him. But as she moved towards the newly formed doorway, the wall seemed to swell, its surface rippling like water. The opening began to shrink, the edges of the door slowly merging back into the solid plaster. Harding! She screamed, lunging for the diminishing gap. But before she could reach it, the wall sealed itself with a soft thump, leaving no trace of the opening, only the faded floral wallpaper. She was alone, and Harding was trapped, somewhere in the bowels of the Ozymandias, where the shadows were more than just an absence of light. A muffled shout reached her, then a metallic clang. Harding! Elissa scrabbled back, pressing her back against her own apartment door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The horror of it, the impossible reality, washed over her. The Ozymandias wasn't just old, not just sentient. It was malevolent. It wasn't merely predicting the future. It was sculpting it. Chapter 6. the building's script. Elissa spent the rest of the day in a state of terror-fueled paralysis, huddled in her apartment, listening. The building hummed around her, a low, predatory purr. She heard nothing more from Harding. No screams, no more metallic clangs, just the profound, unsettling silence that now felt less like peace and more like the stillness of a predator digesting its prey. The whispers continued, a relentless, insidious chorus. They weren't just about Mrs. Albright or Detective Harding anymore. They sifted through the histories of every tenant who had ever lived in the Ozymandias, a cacophony of minor tragedies, small triumphs, and ultimately despair. She heard about Mr. Henderson in 1B, who had lost his fortune in the stock market crash of '29 and quietly starved. About the young lovers in 5D who succumbed to the Spanish flu. About children who vanished on their way to school, their parents driven mad by the sudden, inexplicable loss. And then she heard the phrase, chilling and repeated by 1,000 indistinct voices. The echoes feed us. The echoes nourish. Elissa pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block out the insidious chorus. But the whispers weren't just external sounds. They seemed to penetrate her very bones, vibrating in her teeth, setting her nerves on edge. She staggered to her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard, searching. Urban legend, sentient architecture, psychic imprints. She found isolated articles about buildings rumored to be haunted, even a few fringe theories about energy fields generated by human emotion. But none of it encompassed the Ozymandias. The Ozymandias didn't just passively absorb history, it created it. A horrific realization dawned on her, a cold tendril of dread wrapping around her heart. The disappearances, Sarah Jenkins, Harding now, they weren't just random events. The building wasn't a passive archive. It was a hunger. The walls, she understood with a terrible clarity, were a sentient, hungry entity. They were a physical manifestation of the city's collective trauma, a grotesque repository of fear, loss, and suffering. Each tenant who lived here, each soul who poured their hopes and anxieties into these rooms, fueled it. Their emotional echoes, their life force, were the building's nourishment. And the whispers? They weren't random predictions. They were a script. The building didn't just predict the future. It scripted it. It whispered events into existence, guiding its residents, manipulating circumstances, orchestrating their lives towards a preordained, usually tragic conclusion. This wasn't about survival for its own sake. It was about ensuring a continuous flow of echoes, a perpetual feast of human experience, particularly the painful kind. Elissa stumbled back from her laptop, knocking over a stack of books. Her thesis, The Architecture of Oblivion, felt like a cruel joke. She hadn't been studying oblivion. She had moved into its very heart. The whispers took on a new personal edge. They were no longer just distant narratives. They wove her name into the tapestry of future events, a subtle, chilling thread. Elissa Chance, the historian, soon to be. She covered her mouth, a gasp stifled by her trembling hand. She was trapped in a building that devoured lives, a building that was already writing her into its dreadful narrative. The Ozymandias was not just a home for urban decay. It was a factory of despair, constantly regenerating itself with the fresh trauma of its inhabitants. And she, Elissa Chance, was the latest ingredient. Part 3. The Climax and Revelation. Chapter 7. The Archivist of Agony. The whispers about Elissa grew louder, more insistent, weaving themselves into the very fabric of her days and nights. They were no longer distant murmurs, but intimate pronouncements, delivered with a chilling certainty. Her skin will turn to plaster, her bones to laugh. The archivist of agony she shall become, a new voice in the chorus, guiding the next tenant to their doom. Elissa felt a cold, creeping numbness begin to settle over her, a desperate lethargy that threatened to consume her will. Her own skin felt strangely dry, brittle, like old plaster. She ran her hands over her arms, half expecting to feel the roughness of brick, the coldness of mortar. Her bones ached, a deep, pervasive throbbing that felt less like fatigue and more like calcification. She was becoming the building, piece by agonizing piece. She saw herself in the polished surface of a cracked mirror, eyes sunken, hair dull, a pallor that was less human and more like the faded cream of the wallpaper. She was fading, dissolving into the very decay she had come to study. One afternoon, a week after Harding's disappearance, Elissa forced herself out of her apartment, driven by a desperate need for human contact, any contact that wasn't the insidious chorus of the walls. The air in the hallway was thick, heavy, pressing down on her. The silence, now, felt like a judgment. As she rounded the corner towards the elevator, she saw her, Mrs. Albright. The old woman stood by her door, precisely where Elissa had helped her after the teapot incident. But this wasn't the kind, fragile Mrs. Albright Elissa remembered. Her eyes, usually sparkling with gentle warmth, were now milky and vacant, staring straight ahead, as if peering through Elissa, through the very building itself, into some distant, terrible vista. A faint, knowing smile played on her lips. Mrs. Albright was whispering. It wasn't the low, collective murmur of the walls, but a single, reedy voice, clear and distinct. And it was speaking of a young man, a student, who would move into 4A next Tuesday. It spoke of his ambitions, his dreams of becoming a writer, of the particular brand of coffee he preferred, of the scar on his left knee from a childhood accident. And then it spoke of his future. He will find inspiration in the silence, believing it amuse. He will begin a story of a haunted building, not knowing he writes his own end. His last whisper will be trapped in the novel's final sentence. Elissa felt a scream well up in her throat, choking her. This was it. This was her fate. Mrs. Albright was the cracked vessel, the archivist of agony, her consciousness now absorbed by the Ozymandias, her voice merely an extension of its will, guiding the next unsuspecting victim towards their preordained doom. Mrs. Albright wasn't just predicting, she was narrating the script, and Elissa was next in line. Her skin, her bones, her consciousness. She would be the next voice, the next guide, the next archivist. Mrs. Albright turned her head then, her milky eyes settling on Elissa. The faint smile widened, devoid of warmth, filled only with the chilling, ancient knowledge of the building. "Hello, Elissa." Mrs. Albright's voice was the building's voice, a dry rattle that felt like dust in Elissa's throat. "The new tenant arrives soon. You will have so much to tell him." Chapter 8. The Grasping Walls. The sight of Mrs. Albright, soulless and hollow, a mere mouth for the Ozymandias, snapped Elissa out of her paralyzing terror. This wouldn't be her fate. She wouldn't become a vessel, a grotesque mouthpiece. She would fight. Instinct took over. Flee, get out, escape the Ozymandias before it fully consumed her. She turned and ran, not towards her apartment, but towards the main stairwell, the quickest exit. Her feet pounded on the cracked marble steps, a desperate rhythm against the building's silent, predatory hum. The air grew thicker with every step, heavy with the stench of mildew and something else, something metallic, like rust and old blood. The ornate molding along the stairwell walls, once a beautiful, if decaying, detail, suddenly seemed to stretch. The intricate plasterwork, depicting intertwining vines and flowers, appeared to elongate, the tendrils reaching out like grasping fingers. Shadows deepened, twisting into grotesque shapes that writhed in her peripheral vision. The banister, cold and slick under her hand, felt alive, its wood grain shifting and writhing. She could hear the whispers now, a roaring, triumphant chorus that throbbed in her skull. "You cannot leave. You are ours now." She reached the ground floor, her lungs burning, her legs screaming in protest. The grand lobby, once an imposing space, now felt like the maw of a beast. The heavy oak front doors, her only exit, seemed impossibly far away, framed by a shifting, liquid darkness. As she scrambled towards them, a figure emerged from the shadows by the reception desk. Mr. Silas. He stood there, perfectly still, his parchment skin more yellowed, his bright eyes more chillingly vacant than before. He wasn't just old, he was ancient, a living fossil. And then Elissa understood. Mr. Silas wasn't the caretaker. He was just like Mrs. Albright. He was the building's latest cracked vessel, kept alive or animated only to lure new blood, new echoes into the Ozymandias' hungry embrace. His initial warning, the building remembers everything, even the things that haven't happened yet, wasn't a quirk. It was a declaration of the building's power, delivered by its oldest captive. He was a living advertisement for the Ozymandias, a trap disguised as a welcome. Leaving so soon, Miss Chance? Silas's voice was the dry rattle she remembered, but now it held a chilling edge of proprietary satisfaction. His milky eyes, like Mrs. Albright's, held no hint of the man he once was, only the vast, cold awareness of the building. The whispers throbbed around her, a triumphant crescendo. Elissa felt the raw plaster dust on her tongue, the weight of lath in her bones, the coldness of stone in her veins. She was becoming the building. Every fiber of her being screamed in protest. Flight was impossible. The Ozymandias wouldn't let her go. Its tendrils were already wrapped around her soul. But if she couldn't escape it, maybe she could destroy it. Chapter 9. The Heart of the Ozymandias. The idea, born of desperation and the sheer force of her academic training, hit Elissa with a blinding clarity. Destroy the building from within. If the Ozymandias was a living entity, it must have a heart. She slammed the heavy brass key to her apartment into her palm. Her thesis, her research, blueprints. The city archives held detailed plans of every pre-war building, including the Ozymandias. She had studied them, memorized their intricate details. She dashed past Mr. Silas, ignoring his silent knowing gaze, and flew back up the stairs, the molding still seeming to twitch and stretch. She burst into her apartment, her eyes scanning her research materials. Stacks of schematics, structural analyses, historical records. Where would a narcissistic, perhaps even megalomaniacal architect entomb himself? Not in the grand foyer, too public. Not in the residential units, too mundane. A secret, a hidden chamber. The architect, she suddenly realized, hadn't just built a building, he had built a monument to himself, a living tomb. Her eyes fell on a faded blueprint, a late addition to the original plans, tucked away in a folder labeled Substructure Anomalies. A small, unmarked chamber, behind the furnace, in the deepest part of the original basement, beneath the main utility lines. The Ozymandias was old, predating modern safety regulations. It would have had a massive coal-fired furnace. The building pulsed around her, the whispers swirling into a dizzying vortex, trying to cloud her thoughts, to distract her. You cannot escape. You are ours. But Elissa fought back, fueled by a fierce, primal will to survive. She grabbed a small, heavy ball-peen hammer from her toolkit, a relic from a brief, misguided attempt at DIY renovations. It felt reassuringly solid in her trembling hand. She raced back down, past Mr. Silas, who merely watched her, his silent smile chilling her to the bone. She found the new basement entrance where Harding had disappeared, but the wall was now solid, impenetrable. The building was playing its games. No, Elissa whispered, pressing her palm against the plaster. Not this way. The real way. She remembered the original basement access, a heavy bolted door hidden in a forgotten service hallway that branched off the main lobby. It was dark, a place no tenant would ever normally venture. She found it, its rusty bolts groaning as she forced them open. The air in the proper basement was thick and cold, heavy with the scent of damp earth, rust, and something else, something ancient and stagnant, like breath held for a century. The groaning hum of the building intensified, vibrating through the stone floor directly into her bones. She navigated the maze of pipes, dusty storage units, and defunct machinery, guided by her memory of the blueprints. Each turn felt deliberate, the shadows seeming to stretch and contract to confuse her. She heard faint sounds, the scuttling of unseen things, a soft scratching noise that might have been rats or something far worse. Finally, she found it. The colossal rusted furnace, rising like a forgotten god in the deepest chamber of the basement. Its flaking metal surface was cold, a monument to a bygone era. Behind it, as the blueprint had shown, was an anomaly, a section of the wall, different from the rest, subtly darker, smoother, a false wall, a seal. This was it, the heart, the architect's tomb. She raised the hammer, her arm trembling, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She was going to smash it. She was going to break the cycle. She was going to free herself, Harding, Mrs. Albright, and all the others. She was going to end the Ozymandias hunger. Chapter 10. The Ultimate Whisper. The hammer felt impossibly heavy in Elissa's hand, a small, blunt weapon against a monstrous, ancient evil. She aimed for the center of the false wall, her arm already aching with the effort. One blow. That's all it would take to begin. But as she drew back her arm, poised to strike, the whispers erupted. Not a chorus this time, but a singular, deafening roar that ripped through her mind, reverberating in her very soul. It was the building's voice, direct and absolute. Your arrival was whispered a century ago. Your discovery, the architect's tomb, foretold in the damp stone. Even this futile swing of the hammer, scripted before your birth. Elissa froze, her arms suspended in midair. The ultimate truth, soul-crushing and utterly devastating, crashed over her. Her entire journey, her academic curiosity, her move into the Ozymandias, the initial whispers, her encounters with Mrs. Albright and Detective Harding, her desperate research, her frantic search for the heart, every single step, every thought, every agonizing choice had been whispered a century ago. She wasn't fighting the building. She wasn't breaking the cycle. She was merely performing her role in a narrative that had already been intricately drafted, every twist and turn meticulously planned by the Ozymandias itself. She was a puppet, dancing on strings she couldn't see, controlled by a master she couldn't defeat. The realization was a blow, far more impactful than any hammer. It wasn't despair. It was a profound cosmic futility. There was no escape, no victory, just an endless preordained loop. The whispers continued, softened now, almost soothing in their terrible finality. They described her transformation, her consciousness joining the vast collective mind of the building. Her skin would turn to plaster, her bones to laugh, her blood to the damp mortar that bound the bricks. She would become a permanent resident, a voice in the chorus, forever narrating the fates of those who would come after, the archivist of agony. Her vision blurred. The hammer slipped from her grasp, clattering uselessly on the stone floor. The Ozymandias, vast and indifferent, embraced her. Its cold breath seeped into her lungs. Its history became her own. She felt her individuality dissolve, her thoughts merging with 1,000 other echoes. The architect's tomb, the furnace, the whispers. It was all a stage, and she was merely an actor in a play that had no end. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, the world was no longer just what she saw. It was what the walls remembered, what they had always remembered, what they would always remember, and what they would tell. Part 4. The Echoes Endure. Chapter 11. The New Tenant. Days, weeks, months passed. The city outside continued its relentless march, indifferent to the silent machinations within the Ozymandias Apartments. The sun still rose and set, painting the grime-streaked windows in hues of defiance and despair. One crisp autumn morning, a moving truck pulled up to the curb outside the Ozymandias. Its faded, peeling facade seemed to watch, unblinking, as a young man emerged from a taxi, carrying a worn leather satchel and a guitar case. He was in his mid-twenties, with bright, hopeful eyes and a head full of dreams. His name was Thomas. He was a struggling musician, seeking quiet inspiration, a place where the noise of the world couldn't reach him. The Ozymandias, with its cheap rent and profound silence, seemed perfect. Mr. Silas, his parchment skin now a little more translucent, his eyes a little more vacant, emerged from the shadows of the lobby. He extended a single heavy brass key. Apartment 2B. Elissa's old apartment. A word of warning, young man, Silas rasped, his voice a dry rustle. The building remembers everything, even the things that haven't happened yet. Thomas smiled, a polite, slightly nervous smile. Right, he said, taking the key. A real piece of history, this place. He admired the key's ornate engraving. He hauled his meager belongings up the grand stairwell, the ornate molding seeming to stretch and twist in his peripheral vision. The air was thick with the scent of mildew, old wood, and something indefinably metallic, like forgotten blood. He breathed it in, mistaking it for the alluring scent of antiquity. He unlocked the door to 2B and stepped inside. The apartment was vast, echoing, and profoundly silent. The high ceilings, the intricate crown molding, the faded floral wallpaper with its pink roses, it all spoke of an era long past, a place where stories might be waiting to be told. Perfect for a musician seeking inspiration. He began to unpack, placing his guitar carefully in a corner, setting up his small makeshift recording studio. He hummed a tune, a melody already forming in his mind, inspired by the profound quiet. As midnight approached, he found himself drawn to the bed, collapsing onto the worn mattress. The silence was absolute, a velvet cloak that felt strangely comforting. He reached under the bed, retrieving his journal and a pen, intending to jot down the day's thoughts, his nascent song lyrics. As his fingers brushed against the floorboards, he heard it. A soft, feminine voice, seemingly emanating from the wallpaper next to his ear. A whisper. It was Elissa's voice, gentle, clear, yet tinged with an ancient, knowing sorrow. Under your bed, Thomas, where your hand now rests, she whispered, her voice weaving through the faded floral pattern. You will find a small, leather-bound journal. It belongs to a historian, Elissa Chance. It contains her notes on urban decay and a detailed, terrified account of this very building. Read it carefully. It will tell you of the woman who used to live here and of the detective who vanished in the cellar, seeking secrets the walls had already revealed. Thomas froze, his hands still under the bed. A shiver, not of cold, but of profound unease, traced its way up his spine. He pulled out a small, leather-bound journal, just as the whisper had described. Its cover was worn, its pages filled with neat, precise handwriting that grew increasingly frantic as he flipped through them. He heard the whisper again, fainter this time, but unmistakably Elissa's. And tonight, just before dawn, when the silence feels deepest, you will hear a new melody. It will be the building song, Thomas, and it will be your own. Outside, the Ozymandias stood, a dark sentinel against the starlit sky. The past hadn't just survived within its walls, it had consumed the future, weaving a new thread into its eternal, whispered tapestry. And Thomas, the musician, had just picked up the first terrifying note of his own pre-written symphony.